Good evening to our Columbia community, and welcome to our Columbia College Women Virtual Author Series. The Virtual Author Series spotlights alumni authors and facilitates discussion about their work. Today, you'll hear from Crystal Hana Kim, college class of 2009, and School of the Arts class of 2014, as she discusses her book titled The Stone Home. In conversation with Hannah Lillith Assadi, college class of 2008, and the school class of the arts class of 2013. Thank you for joining us. I'm TJ Givens, Columbia College class of 2019, and the programming co-chair for the Columbia College Women, the official alumni organization of the college. The mission of Columbia College Women is to amplify the voices and leadership of women at Columbia College and across the university. We are committed to fostering a dynamic community that supports alumni and students throughout their entire lives. Before we get started, please note if you would like to participate in our Q&A during tonight's discussion, please enter your question, including your graduating year, into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. Your entry will only be visible to the facilitator. If your question is selected, we will ask your question on your behalf. Please submit questions at any time throughout the presentation. For optimal viewing, please enter your full screen mode. Without further ado, let me introduce our authors. Crystal Hana Kim is the author of critically acclaimed novels, The Stone Home, a finalist for the Maya Angelou Book Award and NPR's Best Book of 2024, and If You Leave Me, which was named a Best Book of 2018 by over a dozen publications. Kim is the recipient of 2022's National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35 Award and the winner of the 2017 PEN Robert J. Dow Short Story Prize for Emerging Writers. She lives in Brooklyn, New York with her family. This is not the book that we will be covering tonight, but I absolutely adore this profound quote from If You Leave Me to give you insights into her incredibly vivid and moving work. I realized we were lurching towards a brand new world, one where women would disappear with foreigners, where Americans would never leave us alone, and where they didn't simply provide us with money, but their ways of living as well. It's just absolutely amazing, and thank you for being here tonight, Crystal. Hannah Lillith Assadi, CC’08 and SOA'14, is the author of Sonora, 2017, which received the Rosenthal Family Foundation Award and the American Academy of the Arts and Letters, and was a finalist for the PEN Robert W. Bingham Prize. Her second novel, The Stars Are Not Yet Bells, 2022, was named a New Yorker and NPR's Best Book of 2022. Her third novel, Paradiso 17, inspired by the life of her late Palestinian father, is forthcoming in 2026. She teaches fiction at the Columbia University School of the Arts and the Pratt Institute. In 2018, she was named a 5 Under 35 honoree by the National Book Foundation. A big welcome to our alumni speakers. Let's get started. Thank you both.
Thank you so much, TJ, for that introduction. It's such an honor to be here with you, Crystal. Hey, Crystal.
Hi, how are you?
I'm thinking about Columbia because I'm going to Columbia tomorrow to teach my workshop first class of the semester. So getting ready to go back to campus and preparing for this event, I was sort of thinking a little bit nostalgically about my college days on campus. And I was wondering if we could just start this conversation by sort of reflecting on our days at Columbia. Feels like a long time ago. But
It really does.
I was thinking about sort of like, I don't get to go to a lot of the buildings on campus. I go to Dodge, and last semester I was in Kent, and it feels very like compartmentalized when I'm on campus these days. But as an undergrad, you're sort of going all over the place. And I was wondering if you could just talk, before we get into your book, just talk a little bit about like a moment in a building that really like reflected your experience in college, or just specific sort of site on campus still sits with you.
Yeah, I haven't been on campus in a couple of years, and it does feel kind of far away now. I feel old, but I have such fond memories of Columbia because I really do think for me, like getting into Columbia and going to Columbia changed the trajectory of my life. And in one way, it really helped me to become a writer. So I have like a story that I tell all my friends, a story that I tell students is senior, I always wanted to be a writer ever since I was little. I took my first creative writing classes at Columbia. I was an English major, and I had this secret dream of being a writer, but I didn't really understand how to become one, right? That path seems so obscure to me. And I was afraid to even kind of like say it aloud to my friends. And senior year, I had already gotten a job doing joining Teach for America, but I was sitting on the steps, right, of the library. It was May, early May, and I told one of my best friends from Barnard that I actually wanted to be a writer and that I wanted to one day go to grad school for creative writing, but that I was scared. And I distinctly remember that night because she was one who said, "You have to do it. Like after your DFA commitment, you have to like invest in yourself and give yourself that opportunity." And I don't think I would have applied to grad school if it wasn't for that moment. And because of her, I decided to go to Columbia MFA for my master's. So the steps of Low Library always have kind of like a special place in my heart,
Yeah, those spring days, those first
Yes.
moments of sunlight. I feel like now I really still look forward to those days, even though I don't sit with the students all sitting there, but I have such nostalgia when I see them
Mhm.
doing it. That's a really beautiful story. I sort of relatedly, I wonder if you could talk about if there were any classes that you took as an undergrad, and or like specific professors that really sort of informed your journey. It sounds like you always knew you wanted to write.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
did always want to know. I always wanted to write. And I remember the creative writing department became a major when I was like a sophomore or junior, but I had already committed to English and I kind of loved the English department. Uh, I remember finding some of my favorite books in Bruce Robbins's class. Did you ever take him? I think it
Yes.
was called like 20th century modern literature or something
Yeah.
like that. And I read The Lover by Marguerite Duras for the first time in that class. I read Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. There's so many kind of modern texts that I had not encountered before that I discovered in that class. And I remember I think the professor was Julie Crawford, and I think she taught this one semester class where we just read Paradise Lost, and it was
Oh.
incredible. It like blew my mind. We just read one book for the whole semester. And that was, made an impression on me.
Yeah, no, that I took that Bruce Robbins class too, and still some of those books we read in that class are my favorite, or some of The
Yes.
Lover, The English Patient.
The English
Um,
patient, I love the English patient so
yeah,
much.
yeah, and
Yes.
we read that in that class, so that's really
Yeah.
amazing.
Mhm.
Well, we're here to talk about The Stone Home, which is your second novel, and before you read from it a little bit, I just wanted to give the audience what the Washington Post had to say. It came out to great acclaim last spring, and there was many incredible reviews of this book. But I thought this reviewer in the Post, like just in the Washington Post, just got it so beautifully. And they say the beauty of Kim's prose creates a lyrical counterpoint to the atrocities she depicts, heightening the sense of poignancy, intimacy, and horror. Some fiction is both story and testimonial, a bearing witness to lessons that must not be forgotten. Haunting and elegiac. Did I say that word right? The Stone Home is fearless in its clear-eyed recounting. I just
Mm.
think that couldn't have said it better. So anyway, if you would just read a little bit for us so we can get the flavor of the text before I ask you more questions.
Yeah.
And
Thank you
audience,
for
as you
that.
have questions, please put it in the Q&A so that I will get to them at the end.
Hmm. Thank you for that. That review meant a lot to me because it was really beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to just read the first page. It's from May 1980, and I think it really encapsulates the kind of tone of the piece and the premise. May 1980. The night my mother and I were stolen, we had been in an alley outside a go-go club in Konsan, the air thick and gritty with cigarette smoke, studded with a scent of stale beer and dried squid. She's sick. I need money, please. Amma gestured to me, squatting by a slick sewer grate. I wore sneakers that had once been white. The cracked rubber base let in a wash of rainwater, my sockless feet puckered and raw, my laces gray and frayed but bowed. I pinched the skin above my ankle, hating her for using me, hating that we needed it. If I pinched 100 times without complaint, she would get enough money for a meal. I was up to 87 when the police came. A net of curses, pelting, arms, swatting arms, a rock I tried to slash across the men's faces. Our wrists grabbed tight behind our backs. In the paddy wagon, Amma screamed and screamed. Time passed in layers until the moon slid along the porthole window, and I looked down. My yellow shirt was damp with sweat, tears. The cotton clung to my ribs, revealing a river of bones.
Thank you so much. Just so gorgeous and yet so
Thank you.
harrowing at once. I think sort of just like actually that passage like represents the experience of the entire book. You're such an incredible stylist. I've always known that since graduate school, and I think this book
Oh,
really exemplifies it. But I kind of want to start out by talking about that because many people in the audience will not have read the book yet, but hopefully will after tonight. And one of the things that you do so well, and like what's really struck me reading this, is that this book like accomplishes such poetry and such lyricism, which I'm sure everybody just heard, right? And at the same time, it's unflinching in its portrait of violence and abuse and torture. And I wondered how, like, as a writer, you found that balance between like your just like your formal aesthetics, which you've always been so good at in your last book and obviously here, and this like sort of like really brutal subject matter. Like, was that a struggle? Like, what was sort of your process working that out?
yeah. So the novel is set in a reformatory center, and it's based on true events. So it is really heavy material, and it's something that I uh, took my time getting into, right? And I wanted to represent this like hidden part of Korean history. And that was really important to me. And that I knew that meant that I had to be honest, I had to be unflinching, I had to kind of bring the reader into the space, but I also wanted to protect them, right? So one of the ways in which I did that, I think, was through language. I love texture, I love sonic surprises, I love poetic kind of rhythms, and to me, I thought that kind of artistry is one way to enrapture the reader, to give them something else to like look forward to and miss all of the difficulty in terms of subject matter. And I also am just kind of like a very sensory person. So for me, getting the reader into the mind of the characters and getting the reader to feel and taste and hear and smell what they are feeling is, I think, the best way to transport someone. And so I really wanted to focus on those kind of like granular details. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it feels so embodied, I think, as a result,
Mm.
right? And that's like part of the torture, actually. Like the good writing actually like heightens the sense of violence and threat that
Hmm.
these characters are experiencing and that we're experiencing, sort of vicariously alongside them. I sort of like related, like one of the things that is also so embodied about this novel is the sense of place. I mean, like you
Mm.
really bring us into this institution, and it's terrifying and it's claustrophobic, and it smells and there are lice, right? Then I wondered like how like what research you did on this, like
Hmm.
sites like these, like did you actually go and visit former sites that resembled the stone home? Like what was your sort of process of research in terms of setting?
Yeah. So I first heard about these reformatory centers, I think, in 2016, because there was an Associated Press expose that revealed that in 1980 South Korea, these institutions had been formed in an effort to kind of like quote unquote clean up the streets because the dictatorship then wanted to get ready for the Olympics, right? And in the expose, they interviewed a survivor named Han Jong-san, and he is now like this big political activist whose whole life is trying to get the Korean government to recognize, apologize, and give some sort of like recompense for their actions, right? So I was just really, I couldn't stop thinking about this story. And so when I was in Korea visiting family in 2018, I found Han Jong-sun, right? I found his email somehow. It was like a whole elaborate search. I found his email and I met him outside of the Seoul National Assembly. He was living there in a makeshift hut that he had made out of like plank and tarp because he said, I'm going to live outside the assembly until the South Korean government acknowledges what they did. And next to his hut, there were these big poster boards with images of the Brothers Home, which is one of the main largest institutions. And there were these images cut out from newspaper clippings showing all the praise that the founder of this institution had, and then photos from inside it showing the reality. So I didn't get to go to the Brothers Home because it's no longer there. You know, that site has been razed and is just like a bunch of apartment buildings. But I got to speak to him.
Wow.
And I didn't even really know I was writing this novel until after that conversation. I just was really kind of like driven by my need to kind of understand, like, how can this happen? Like, how could the government, I mean, this sounds naive, I guess, but how could the government oppress their own citizens in this way, right? Especially children. Um, so it was kind of, I had that conversation with him out of a place of kind of trying to understand the world, right, in our society. And he actually said during that conversation, you know, a lot of people ask me for my story, but nothing happens, right? Nothing really, there's no kind of change. And he asked me to to do something with this information, right? To act. And I think that is really the moment when I decided, like, okay, I'm really going to write this novel. And then after that, I did a lot of research kind of in a sideways way. What I realized is these reformatory institutions are not just singular to Korea, right? They happened in the American South. They happened in like a boarding school version in Canada with the First Nations children. There were kind of institutions like these in Australia with Indigenous children. So I realized that actually um, this kind of oppression, this particular oppression through an institution that houses vagrants or children happens all the time. So I did a lot of research into these other institutions.
Yeah, wow. I mean, it's incredible how you like resurrected something through all of these sort of like different, pieces. And that just hearing this story just haunted you, right? And it just sort of took you
Hmm.
really, sometimes that's how it is, right? I know a lot of
Yeah.
people in the audience have questions about inspiration, and we'll talk more and more about that, but I think you really answered that there as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about craft, and I know it'll be hard for those who haven't read it, but I think many people probably have taken creative writing workshops or are working on their own writing. And one of
Hmm.
the things about this novel, I just wanted to sort of ask you about some of your decisions, but one of the things about this novel is that it's comprised by very short chapters, right?
Hmm.
That helps it sort of its sense of propulsion. But also it alternates between sort of this like time period in the early 80s and then this frame story in 2011. And I wanted to sort of ask you, part one, sort of like how you found yourself inside of this structure, right? As well as the sort of
Hmm.
short alternating chapters. And part two, of my like craft question is how you decided to alternate between the first person
Mm.
perspective from Unju and the third person from Sangshul. And I'm sorry, I'm saying those.
No,
You
that's
went over this,
great.
but maybe you could, so those are like two-part craft
Yeah,
questions.
yeah, yeah. Thank you. I love talking about craft, and I'm assuming there are like writers or people who are working on novels in the audience. So the novel, I just read that opening scene that's set in 1980, and that is from the perspective of Unju, who gets taken into the Stone Home, which is my version of the Brothers Home Reformatory Center. Um, but there's also a frame story, like Hannah said, that starts in 2011. And in that section, we see this young Korean American woman arrive at a 40-something-year-old Unju's home with a knife. And she says, my father is dead. He left me this knife and he told me to come find you to tell me the truth about him. And that meeting between this random stranger, right, Nare, this Korean American, at Unju's home is what forces Unju to think back to her past, to think back to this 1 year of her youth when she and her mother were forced into the reformatory center. And then from there, Unju tells her story in first person and Sangchar's story in third person. So the reason why I had the 2011 frame and why I have the scenes with these two women in 2011 come back throughout the novel is because I wasn't in the institution, right? And so I wanted to make sure that I was entering the story from the perspective of a respectful outsider. You know, that's also why I'm writing fiction and not nonfiction, because I wasn't personally a victim or a survivor of one of these institutions. And then also because I have this 2011 section, I can use that character, the Korean American woman, to show the larger kind of like systemic operation that created the stone home. Because the people inside it, these children and the victims, they don't know that like the government was involved, right? They don't know that these institutions were formed so that South Korea could put on a good face for the Olympics, right? So I needed that kind of outside perspective. And then again, that 2011 section is what forces Inju to tell the story of her year in the institution. And she also tells the story of this woman, the Korean American woman's father, Sang-chul. And the reason why I had Sang-chul's story in third person is because A, it's not Unju's story, right? She's relaying someone else's story. And also because Sang-chul, his story, his narrative in the novel is pretty difficult and violent, and it can be brutal in some ways. So by putting it in third person, I thought that would be a protective measure for the reader, because then they don't have to be inside the body of this character that becomes really problematic.
Yes. And I think it's such an interesting decision. Like these crafts decisions are very important, right? And have like moral consequences in some ways, right? For the reading
Yeah.
experience. So I thought those decisions were really, really interesting here. And just, once again to reiterate the success of sort of like the short propulsive alternating chapters, like I mean, and I mean that the perspective is sort of alternating, and also like time is shifting back and forth, and it keeps the reader moving, right? So anyway, these are decisions we make, but so beautifully done here. I want to make sure we have time for audience questions, and I have a lot of questions that were pre-written, but I also just have a few more of my own. This is your second novel, and I know from my own experience, it's often a very different experience than the first in so many ways.
Yeah.
Both of your novels are set in two distinct, periods of Korean history. But I wondered if you could just talk just a little bit about the differences, like in writing these two, in terms of research, in terms of like your just like own emotional attachment. Was one easier? Like, did one come out? Was the labor easier? You know what I mean? Like, just maybe a little bit about that.
Yeah. So my first novel is titled If You Leave Me, and that was published in 2018. And I actually started that, the idea for that in undergrad, which is kind of
Oh,
wild.
wow.
Yeah. I didn't so in undergrad in, creative writing workshops, which I had never taken before, but it became like quickly obsessed with as an undergrad. I started writing about these four sisters and like their difficult, complicated mother. And I got, a lot of feedback like that these were compelling characters, and I also found them compelling, and I wanted to understand like why was the mom so complicated and difficult. And so when I went to grad school, I started writing about them more, and that became the kind of core relationship in If You Leave Me, because that is a novel that's set against the Korean War and is about this young woman named Hemi who's 16 and who's fleeing the war at the beginning of the novel, and then she becomes a mother to four daughters. So it started in undergrad, and I think that book came to me more easily because it was kind of inspired by a lot of stories I had heard growing up from my grandmother who survived the Korean War. And she was 16. I mean, she is not, I mean, she would be horrified if she thought that she was Hemi,
Is that her?
the
Yeah.
main character. But she was not Hemi. She's not Hemi. But she also was like this teenager who had to flee the war, who had to take care of her brother, who had to take care of her widowed mother. And she told me very vivid stories of like having to flee and being so hungry that she used to like peel the bark off of trees to get to the inner layer because it's softer and they would eat that, very, very vivid stories. And I would ask her, how did you know what plants to eat when you were hungry? And she said, you just know from watching the birds and seeing which plants that they die from. I don't know, just like the way
Wow.
that she moved through the world was so
Yeah.
different. So If You Leave Me came from that kind of inner desire to like, I must write this down. I must like create this story from all this kind of family lore that I haven't seen in literature. Because whenever I saw novels about the Korean War in America, it's usually from the perspective of an American soldier, right? Or from the perspective of the very rich. And my family was not that. So that one I think came to me more easily. And I also wonder if that's just true of first books because you are writing it in this protective bubble. You don't know if it'll ever be published. I didn't have an agent. You
Yeah.
just are just writing it like very, very protected. And then you publish, and then all of a sudden you realize that at least for me, like I'm coming from a place of art, but then the publishing industry is a business and they care about the business aspect of it, and that's drawing for me. So for the Stone Home, I think it was more difficult to write, not only because of the subject matter, but because I knew more about like what does it mean to be a published author in the world?
Yes. And we'll definitely get into the professional aspect of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some, I think like the first book also has more time somehow to like,
Hmm.
there's like the gestation is longer. And
Yeah.
the second book, there's maybe a little bit more pressure for some of us, right?
Yeah. I mean, people always say your first book is like the story you've been writing your whole life until that moment, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have some time usually.
Hmm.
Um, so one last question from me, and then I want to get there's some questions that came in even before this event. I want to get to those and some really great questions in the Q&A, the live Q&A. So but sort of this is obviously an audience of readers. I'm a big advocate of the idea that one can't write anything that's worth a damn without reading. So I was wondering
Yeah.
what books sort of like inspired you either before writing The Stone Home or in the process of writing it? Like,
Hmm.
what do you feel like it's in conversation with?
Hmm. Um, well, going back to The English Patient and Bruce Robinson's class, that
Yeah.
book really like changed my life. I read it almost every year because I'm so obsessed with it. It's
Oh,
so
no,
what?
I'm so happy to hear that because I just got mine. Like, oh, sorry, mine was in a flood. My copy was like,
No.
yeah, got destroyed in a flood, and I found a copy on the street like the other day, and I was reading.
It's so good. And it just, when you're in a reading rut and you feel like nothing's really hitting, I always go back to that book because, like, language level, it's beautiful. The characters, the way that he weaves in history and politics. So, that book, thank you, Bruce Robbins, I really like is something that I aspired to be like, right? Like that novel and that novel list. And let's see. I love Toni Morrison. I love Louise Erdrich, two authors that I discovered in grad school. And there are so many Korean and Korean American writers that I really admire. There's Don Mi Choi, who wrote DMZ Colony. There's Emily Chung Min Yoon, who's a poet. So Han Gang, whose novel We Do Not Part just came out yesterday and is also about atrocity, Korean atrocity. It's focused on the Jeju massacre. So these are like novelists that I hope to be like part of the conversation with that I really admire. Um, yeah, so those are some that I hold near and dear to my heart.
Good choices.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, I have to. I'm so excited to reread The English Patient. I'm glad we've been talking about it. It's been a
Now
long
I
time.
want to.
I think I
Yeah.
haven't read it since college, so
Oh, it's
I'm
so
excited.
good. It's so good.
Okay. This was so fun. I want to make sure I get to the again. I have some questions that came in before our event, and please keep popping them into the Q&A. I promise we'll get to them. We have plenty of time. Some of the questions that came in sort of before our event have similar sort of themes, so forgive me, but I'm going to group some of them together. Cornelia CC'88 and Christine CC’07 sort of wanted to ask you about, like, we talked a little bit about inspiration, but if there was anything specific happening in the world, and you mentioned sort of the article that came out, but anything else that happened in the world that sort of like drove you to write this story when you wrote it.
Yeah. I mean, the Associated Press article in 2016, right? One thing that I didn't mention was that when I read that article that revealed that these institutions were created in the lead up to the Olympics, what really struck me was that from prior research, I already knew that 4 decades prior to the 1980s and in the 1940s, these institutions were already created by the Japanese who had colonized Korea to kind of change the children of political dissidents, right? So what struck me was that the Japanese had used these institutions to oppress the Koreans, right? To oppress us. And then 40 years later, the oppressed had then become oppressors and was using the same tactic against their own citizens. So that element in that cycle was also something that really motivated me to look into this, right? To research it more, to understand like our human psychology. And one of the books that I read in my research was actually Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is he was a Hungarian psychiatrist who was in I believe it was Auschwitz, one of the Nazi concentration camps, and he survived. And he wrote this memoir about how to maintain hope. And he also mentioned how within these institutions they use prisoners and like kind of create like a social ladder and have prisoners become traitors to their own. So this macro level, oppressed becoming oppressor, then reinforced on a micro level. And that was also happening in these Korean institutions. So there are just all these kind of like reverberations that I was really interested in, that I wanted to understand more on a human level.
Yeah, these sort of dynamics we keep seeing over and over again, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. So there's a lot of people. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. There's a lot of people in the audience. I'm going to start with, I'm going to name a bunch of them, who want to know just sort of like, how does one go from sort of writing the manuscript to getting published? This is a big question, but maybe you could just talk about your process with your debut.
Yeah.
And so some of the people who want to know this are Alexander CC'16, who was in your writing class in the fall of 2012, which is very sweet.
Aww, that's so sweet.
Montana CC'24, Ava CC'25, Kalicia, I think I'm saying that right, CC'12, Kizen, I hope I'm saying that right, CC'28, and Luciana, CC'18. So a lot of people, seems like a lot of aspiring writers in this audience, just sort of wanting some advice, about how to publish.
I get it. I feel like, a lot of people want to write books and publish books. So I guess I can just tell you my story, right?
Yeah.
I started working on, the beginning, like a beginning early version of my first novel, If You Leave Me, in grad school. And in grad school, Hannah and I went to grad school together. I don't know if we mentioned that, but they really focus on craft and art. I feel like they don't really tell us much about publishing, right, Hannah?
No.
They
But we hear
they
about
don't.
it on the sort of sidelines.
Yeah, because we're in New York, so they don't really tell us about it. But so I didn't have an agent or anything like that, and I also was kind of trying to protect myself by not really looking into that because I didn't want to get too caught up in like the political or like businessy aspect of it. And then when I finished the manuscript, which was in 2014 or 2015, then I started querying agents. And I really did a lot of like cold querying. I researched agents by looking at the acknowledgments pages of books that I loved, by looking at what kind of like basically by looking at the acknowledgments pages and doing some research online. And I also had met some agents along the way from writers conferences, and I queried them in batches. And then the agent that I ended up signing with, Catherine Fawcett, she just, when we had our conversation, she just kind of understood what I was trying to do, what I was trying to like the feelings that I was trying to create, the themes that I was trying to explore and investigate. So she just felt like a really good match, because you want your literary agent to be someone, I think, like who is with you ideally for life. And then after that, it's kind of nice because then the agent does the rest, where she, has her contacts. She's the one who comes up with a list of editors that she thinks will be a good fit, and she sent it out to those editors. And I ended up matching, or we agreed to go with my editor, Jessica Williams at William Morrow. And again, she just really seemed to understand what I was trying to do with my first novel. So we signed with her. And I think we signed with her maybe 2016, and then the book came out in 2018, because it usually takes 2 years from, signing with an editor to getting a book published. And I enjoyed my time with Jessica, and I felt really like, listened to and taken care of. So when it came to my second book, I signed with her again. So I hope
Thank
that's
you.
helpful.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think everybody has a different process, but typically, yeah, sounds about standard, right?
Yeah. Like find an agent.
Hopefully
Yeah.
they connect you to an editor who gets your work.
Yeah.
And sometimes people shift agents and sometimes people shift editors, but
Yeah.
that sort of dance is usually involved. And there
Yeah.
are other paths, of course, as well, but everybody has their own. Some people just go indie, right? And sometimes that requires an agent and sometimes it doesn't, right? Going right to a publisher. Some people self-publish, right? So there's
There's a
many different
wide.
paths. But Crystal's is pretty standard. So okay.
Yeah.
So I'll get to some of the live questions, and then hopefully we have time for the rest of the questions that came in too. I think we will. But Elizabeth Sweeney here in the live chat as well had a chat that came in before the event, and also a chat here about characters. So Elizabeth asks, with a big cast of characters, how did you narrow down the number of characters? So that was the first part, one of the question that I received before the event. But this follow-up in the Q&A here, and how did you manage to let those characters go, or do they still live on in your head? So sort of a question about these characters you've created.
Interesting. Yeah, the Stone Home has a much bigger cast than I would say my first novel does, because we have Unju, the girl that we heard from in the reading. We have Sangchar, a boy in the institution. We have like the Korean American woman from the 2011 narrative, and then we also have all the people in the reformatory center. I kept a lot of like meticulous character profile notes to keep track of the characters. And I will say that in my early drafts, there were way too many characters because I was trying to be really true to the logistics that the survivor of the real institution, Han Jong-san, had told me about. And so I was trying to be true to like the numbers there, right? And so the institution was much larger, which meant that I needed more people. But it was really later on in the like drafting process that I realized in order to make my reader care about these characters, I actually have to narrow the focus on the lens so that the reader can like keep track of everyone. So then I kind of merged some of the characters together so that we can really like connect and care. And I mean that's hard to do, but honestly I love revision and I kind of find it like I hate the first draft. I think that first draft is so hard. And I think revision is so much fun because it's like a puzzle. So it was kind of satisfying for me to go through and like meld people together or figure out like I don't need the tertiary character. So that was one way that I kind of narrowed the focus, but it's still like a big cast, and that's when the character profiles come in handy. And then the second part was how do I
Like, how can you let them go? Like after,
mm,
do they
I
still
mean,
live on?
the main characters I think will always stay with me. You know, when I was writing If You Leave Me and after I published that, um, like those characters were really close to my heart and they still are. But they were so close to my heart that when I started writing my second novel, I felt so frustrated because I was like, who are these new characters and why don't I know them as well as my first
Yeah.
book? But it's like that process, right? Where you the more that I get into a new manuscript, the less I feel, I guess, like too precious about my book's characters. Does that make sense? So,
Yeah.
like, I'm working on a third book right now, and I'm getting really excited about that. So I'm like less precious about the Stone Home characters.
Yeah. Yeah. It's always the
Yeah,
move on, right?
yeah.
So moving on, I think some people are excited about this question, and we're always excited to hear about Hollywood potential. So Judy
Oh.
CC'09, I have that right? Yeah. Wants to know, says this book is so vividly written that I had to remind myself that I did not watch it, but only read it. Might it become a series?
Thank you so much. That's so nice. I've like talked to some people about, that, but nothing yet. I would love it to be a mini series. I think that'd be really interesting. Um, it is going to be, I think it is hard to kind of make an all Korean TV show, without Korea involved. So the novel, The Stone Home, is going to be translated into Korean this year. And then I am hoping, once it's in Korea, that'd be cool if we could get like the interest of Korean version of Hollywood. If you know anybody, tell them about the book.
I know, right? Like, please, that's how it happened.
Yeah. So.
Um, Thank you. All right, so moving along, Bob CC'78 asks, I'm curious to know if you see teacher and warden as oppressors, but also oppressed by those off
Mm.
stage who are monitoring them.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Yes. So well, you know, when I wrote The Stone Home, I'm in the perspective of these teenagers who are in the institution. So they don't know the full story. But in order to write anything, I think as an author, you have to empathize with your characters, right? Even like the unlikable ones. So for me, in order to be able to do that and to create fully fleshed out characters, I did have to think about teacher and warden who run this institution with like an eye towards trying to understand like how did they become the people that they become. And I do think that perhaps I don't know if oppressed is the right word, but they are cogs in a larger machine, right? So I wanted to keep that in mind without pardoning them or without forgiving them for their actions, if that makes sense. But a good lesson that I learned when I was writing my first book from a mentor was that she read an early draft of my first book. And when we got together, she said, this character, you don't like him. And if you don't like him, then the reader won't care for him. Like you need to make us care by caring yourself. And that really stayed with me. So I do try to work really hard to try to, emit some sort of empathy, even for the most difficult characters.
Yeah, I think
Thank you,
that's
Bob.
great, great lesson there that
Mm.
I,
Yeah.
I always talk about this with students, right? Like there has to be some reason they're there, right? There has to be
Hmm.
some sympathy for the devil a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise they're not actually that monstrous, in some
Hmm.
way. So,
So
um,
true.
all right, thank you. All right, so Lakeland, I don't have class here, but asks a great question. The gentleman you mentioned in the tent who inspired your book, have you received feedback from him? And is he
Mm.
so proud of you for finally being the person to follow through with the information and story in this most profound way? So, yeah. So has he read this book? And
Thank you for that question. So I emailed him and we've emailed. I haven't been back to Korea since 2018, which is really sad. But COVID happened and then I had two babies. Um so I haven't been back to Korea, but we've emailed. I told him about the book. He said congratulations, and I sent him the book, but I mean it's in English, so I don't think he can't read it, but he understands that our conversation was vital for me writing this book, and I do think he is honored by that. And when the book comes out in Korean this year, I'm gonna send him a copy, and if he wants to he can read it, but also he doesn't have to since he lives through it. But I do keep in touch with him, and um I just am like very thankful to him for sharing his story and for working so hard as an activist to get the story of these real institutions out into the world.
Yeah, hopefully he reads it now. It'd be so
Yeah.
wonderful.
Mm.
Okay, so I think Luis, if your chat is blank, just put your question in the Q&A. Judy's question we answered. Julia Taglieri has a great question. I don't see class here, but you've mentioned a couple times protecting the reader via lyricism, distance through third person POV, but how do you take care of yourself as the author as you're working through these intensely difficult narratives?
That's such a good question, and I've gotten a couple times, and I never have a good answer. Um, uh, or like I get another variation of the question of like, you seem like a happy person. Why do you write about such difficult material? And I never know. I think I have a dark soul, but I think it is really difficult, and I'm writing, like I mentioned, I'm writing a third book that's takes place in New York, and it's just very different, and it feels so much lighter coming to the page. So only in retrospect am I really realizing, oh, the past couple years when I was in the stone home was difficult.
Yeah.
But since my first book was published, I had between 2018 when my first book was published and 2024 when the stone home was published, I had two kids. And I think that is really like my source of joy and wonder, because there's nothing like more astonishing than seeing your baby grow and interact with the world, and like learn about the world. And so I think that is really where I get my relief from.
Yeah, I'm hearing my kids like running across. Hopefully not everybody else is,
Oh no, and
but giggling with joy. And I do
yeah,
agree. I do agree. They really offer some reprieve, right?
yeah.
Okay, so the final few questions from the live Q&A that I'm seeing, and then I want to move back just to two more that I received in advance of the event. This is an anonymous question. I'm going to kind of put them together because it's about sort of like the writing life. So the question is, how impactful were writing events such as conferences, fellowships, etc., in getting you published? And what are your preferred writing tools? Do you work in Word, Google Docs, Scrivener, etc.?
Okay. I think it's always hard to kind of know like what actually helped you in getting published. But I do think for me, I think going to grad school was really important because it gave me time to just focus on my writing. I mean, I was actually teaching university writing, a class that we've all taken, at the same time, but it did give me time to focus on my writing. It gave me time to think of myself as a writer in a serious way. And it gave me like such an incredible education on craft, right? And what it means to look at a book not only as a reader, but as a writer, right? Like as a craftsperson, as an artist. I do think that going to conferences and fellowships are helpful because you do meet agents that way, right? If you're trying to get published. But I will say my agent that I ended up with, I had never met before. So it's not like a one-to-one, at least for me. The other, like the greater thing I think about those conferences is you meet other people, like other writers that are kind of at the same stage of the career as you, and some of those people have become my friends for life. And it's nice to be able to lean on someone who's also, you know, at that stage of trying to finish their first book, or also at that stage of trying to find an agent. And if they're like a little bit of ahead of you, then they can give you some, you know, good advice. And if they're a little bit behind you, you can, you know, spread the good, like the good energy by also sharing your advice. So I think it, to me, that community is really important. I put a lot of value and emphasis on literary community and friendships like that, but I don't know how, like, it's not like one of those conferences helped me find my specific agent or my specific editor, but I do think it's like helpful to just broaden your understanding of like what does it mean to be like a writer in the world. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah.
Uh,
Oh,
yeah.
that wasn't my question, but yeah, community, right? It's so important.
Yeah. And then the other one was like, what kind of, how do I write?
Yeah, like what tools you use.
Okay, so I do a lot of note taking in a notebook by hand. And then for my first draft, I use Scrivener, which is you know, a writing app tool, because I'm trying to like figure out all my, you know, where do my chapters go, and there's a section for notes, and there's a section to keep your character profiles. But by the time I have you know, like a full draft, I actually change it to a Word document, because something about the visuals of Scrivener don't work for me, and my brain kind of gets overstimulated. So then I just go to, you know, a good old Word doc, and that's how I move through the book.
I've never seen Scrivener, so
Oh, really?
no,
I'll
yeah,
show it to you.
yeah, I'll have to check it out at some point.
Yeah.
I'm an old school, yeah, write by hand and Word doc.
Yeah. Do you write your novels by hand?
You know what? I wrote a lot of the second book by hand, weirdly,
Mm.
but not the third, and I don't think the first either. So, but the first draft of the second book was written by hand first. So,
Oh my gosh, I couldn't do that. My handwriting's not very good.
yeah, no, I don't know. Yeah, it was just how I did it, but it's probably
Yeah.
not gonna happen again. Okay, so I have one final sort of like set of questions from the pre-sent questions before we sort of start to wrap up. And I think you've sort of answered this a lot already, but in ways, but perhaps you can leave us with one sort of like final note. Lauren, PH24, Lucy CC'25, and Marissa SW'22 sort
Mm.
of have like want to know like, where do you find the light in all this darkness?
Mm.
How do you keep going through this trauma that you sort of read about and bear witness to in this book and in this world? Yeah, any
Mm. Yeah, that's a good question, and so applicable to just life right now.
yes.
And I think that, you know, when I was little, we didn't have internet. You know, I was like, you know, I didn't discover the internet until I think fifth grade. And I do think like with the proliferation of social media and everything, it's just there's such an inundation of news, and there's such an inundation of like bad news in particular, that I do think it's hard to find the light. For me, art making and writing is so important to my personal, like mental, emotional health. If I'm not writing, I'm just such a grumpy person. And I think it's really essential to the way that I kind of like move and think and am in the world. So I think even when I'm writing about something difficult, like these reformatory centers, even when I'm writing something difficult, like my first book with the Korean War, I think I find such value and hope in the act of trying to preserve a feeling, a relationship, a story through writing. And I think that there's such an honor in being an artist, right? And a privilege in being an artist. So that to me is how I find hope, right? In knowing that I'm amongst like a whole community of those who are trying to make the world better through art is, you know, provides me with a lot of hope.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much. I think that I couldn't answer it better myself, and
Mm.
thank you for sharing this beautiful and urgent book with us. I'm gonna hand it back over to TJ for any.
Thank you, Hannah, so
Thank you,
much.
everybody, for being here.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Hannah, for all the amazing questions.
Thank you all both so much. Thank you, Crystal and Hannah, for this evening's author talk. A big thank you to all the alumni, students, and friends in attendance, and thank you for submitting your questions. They were just wonderful. If you haven't snagged a copy yet of Crystal's book, you can get a personalized signed copy. Thandi put the link in the chat, so please feel free to do that, and she would love to personalize it for you and write it out directly to you. It's just such a special connection that we have here at Columbia. And please save the date for the Columbia College Women's Signature event taking place on campus on April 17th, Dissecting Women in Leadership. And if you're interested in marketing, just a shameless plug here, please join me and my dear friends for a virtual discussion on February 4th titled Innovators and Influencers, Women Driving Marketing Forward. In-house brand marketers from Nike and leading retirement industry innovator Great Gray Trust Company, a founder of a top digital marketing agency, SeedX, and the ex-CEO of Tate's Bake Shop will all be panelists. So we're really looking forward to that event. And also, please join us for our next Columbia College Women Author Talk on March 18th with Rosalind Chow, class of 2002, excuse me. And she will discuss her book, The Doors You Can Open, a new way to network, build trust, and use your influence to create a more inclusive workplace. You really don't want to miss these events. And if you wish to stay involved with the Columbia College community, we would love to have additional help and assistance with planning events just like this. And we would love for you to be as involved as possible in your Columbia College family. So if you wish to stay involved, please email ccwomen@columbia.edu. And again, thank you so much for spending part of your evening with us. We hope you have a great evening. Thank you so much. Bye.